You know, it's never long after talking about God that people will separate the God of the Old Testament from the God of the New Testament, not knowing that they are the exact same God. Nothing has changed, but there's a lot of confusion. You know, I remember when I was in school, I had one teacher that I really liked. When I came in our class, she was real nice. She had this real lively and friendly personality. And then after a while in our class, there were some other people that came in our class that were unruly, that were real wild. And then I would see a completely new side of her. If somebody was to come into class and see her on a day when the students were acting good, then they would see one side of her. And then if they were to come into the class when the students were acting up and being rebellious, they would see a completely different side of her. And I would say that if she looked different on these days, they could even think that these are different people. This is a distinction that's hard for us to make in the Bible because God himself doesn't have a form, he doesn't have a body. So when we're given a narrative about God punishing sin, judging people, and doing these different things in the Bible, a lot of times it's hard for us to understand that it's all the same God, because we see God being merciful in some times, and then we see other times where he is being strict on sin. And we think somehow this is a different God. If the narrative was given to us as God in a physical form, we'd be able to see it more clearly. Since God is not physical, it's very easy for us to separate the different actions of God and make them seem like these are two different gods. Another analogy I think is helpful is somebody is growing a tree. You know, when you grow a tree, when you first plant that seed, you have no choice but to give it some freedom at first. And then say that tree starts to grow, and then all of a sudden it starts becoming a little cricket. It starts going to the left or leaning one way. And what people will do is they will get a tree stake, or what they call a tree trainer. And they either use these bands to pull it a certain way, or they will use this stake to straighten it out. You know, if this tree could talk for itself, he would probably say, you know what, this isn't fair. This is uncomfortable. I don't like it. You're being too strict on me. How come the other trees don't have this stake on them? The reason for this stake is for the tree's own good. You want the tree to be straight and healthy. But then also in the same way, you're actually being more lenient with this tree than you would be with the full-grown tree. You see, this young tree is leaning to the left a little bit. If one of your fully grown trees was doing this leaning, you know what you'd have to do? You'd have to cut it down immediately, because it'd be a danger. So you'd have to cut this tree all the way down for even leaning a little bit. So in one sense, you're being more strict by putting this stake or by putting this tree trainer on it. But in another sense, you're actually being more lenient because you are allowing this tree to lean a little bit. In the same way, we can see this in the Old Testament as God is building his people, as God is growing his people. But remember, when we started with that seed, we allowed freedom. And that seed that God had planted was Adam and Eve, and he gave them freedom. He only had one rule for them, and that was don't eat of this tree. In the same way, when you plant a tree in the ground, when you plant a seed in the ground, you only have one rule for them: grow straight. But once it starts growing in the wrong way, that's when you have to start applying some pressure, because you have to get it straight. And this is the same thing God had to do with his people. When people started to sin, we had to have different rules. So when people see rules like God saying that people must be stoned to death for homosexuality, or if you have an unruly child, you have to stone them to death. We first have to remember that God sees all things. Right here in Hebrews 4:13, we read, "Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account." So in other words, God sees everything. So if you think that God is being unmerciful by setting these rules, remember that everybody that was a homosexual wasn't stoned. Every child that was unruly to his parents wasn't stoned. Many people got away with this for the longest. These rules were set, but just because these rules are set doesn't mean that every single person that did one of these things was killed. God sees all things and was very merciful and allowed these things to go on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Just because you see a speed limit on the freeway, does that mean that everybody has always obeyed this limit, or everybody that has gone over this limit has been pulled over? Of course not. Police will even allow you to go 5 or even 10 miles over the speed limit without even messing with you. God is the same way. He's very lenient, very merciful, but these rules are there to set straight, just like that tree that needs those braces to keep it straight. It may seem harsh at first, but this is all for the betterment of the tree, so it grows to be straight, strong, and healthy. Also, there is some leniency too. See, that tree is already leaning, but instead of cutting it down, we allow it to lean and start working on it to straighten it out. In the same way, there were people in the Old Testament who were practicing polygamy. This was not something that was part of God's plan. It wasn't part of the plan when you plant that seed for the tree to go sideways. But you have to set rules around what is already going on. The tree is already leaning to the left some, so we have to accept that. And so when you first put the braces on, you don't put them all the way straight because you break it. You have to put it on a little bit this way, then a little bit more this way, and a little bit until you start straightening the tree out. In the same way, God had to place rules around the sins that people had already become accustomed to in order to straighten them out and not wipe them out all the way, as he had already promised he would never do again after the flood. A lot of people, they believe that God was just accepting these things. A lot of people believe that God was just accepting slavery, not knowing that the way the word slavery was being used in the Old Testament is not the same way we knew of slavery here in America. As a matter of fact, the type of slavery we knew of here in America was plain and simply kidnapping. It was people going to a different country and kidnapping people, not people in war or anything like that. People just going to kidnap people and use them for slave labor. That is not what we saw in the Bible. As a matter of fact, right here in Exodus 21:16, we read, "He who kidnaps a man and sells him or is found in his hands shall surely be put to death." So this is a rule that God had, plain and simple. That if you kidnap a person and he's found in your hands, this is what the slavery we saw here in America. If someone was to do that, they were to be put to death by the law of God. So these things were never actually accepted. The type of slavery that we saw in the Bible was a work-based slavery. People who owed money to people who were in debt and were working this off. And there's almost always a willing slavery, and it's also for a certain amount of years, and then they were to be set free. This was nothing like the racist slavery that we saw here in America. Another thing we have to remember is a lot of these events that happened in the Old Testament were within a very large amount of time. Over 4,000 years had passed in the time of the Old Testament writings. So that means there was a lot of leniency, a lot of time that people had to repent and to turn from their sins before God cast his judgment upon people. The same thing that we have today, as we are waiting for the return of Jesus, where we will see God's wrath once again. So remember that God hasn't changed. The Bible tells us that Jesus was the image of the invisible God. That's exactly who he is. And we even see in the Bible where Jesus has shown us some of his wrath, but we have not seen the worst of it. Right here in Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. He never changes, and he's waiting for you to repent and put your trust in him before he comes to show his true wrath. Something to think about.